Very good. All right. Thank y'all for sticking around. Hopefully, again, this is, as with anything, hope it's beneficial to you. Hope it helps you, strengthens your faith, strengthens your knowledge of the Bible. Sometimes when you go through these things, maybe I should, that thing's recording, maybe I should teach a little more on the Bible and go through some of those things. And we'll get to that. Again, we'll get to the life and teachings of Christ. And we'll kind of break down some of those parables and those teachings. But sometimes it's good for the history side of it. I enjoy that quite a bit. Going through the history and understanding the Bible a little bit more as we've progressed through here. We finished speaking about the prophets. Last week we finished those up. And again, it brings us to Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament. And typically we have this blank page, or maybe it blank, the next page over is blank, and you flip over and it says New Testament in your Bible. So what we find is that there's quite a bit of stuff happening in that blank sheet of paper. What we find is that we go from the Old Testament. Again, if you go back to Nehemiah, that book, and you're looking at that, and when the Jews come back, y'all are studying that this morning in the adult class in the auditorium. The fact that the Jews come back, what? They've been captured by the Babylonians. They come back, their city's destroyed, right? The temple's destroyed, everything's destroyed. And they begin to rebuild this temple, but they have kind of an inferior temple. They're going to have an inferior temple. And they're kind of like at the mercy of whoever's in charge at the time. So when we look at this, then we go again over into the New Testament, and now we have synagogues. We have something called the Sanhedrin, a court that Christ is carried before. We have, again, Romans being there. You have to carry, Jesus is carried to Herod. What's Herod doing? I don't hear anything about Herod. He is the king of the Jews. Like, when do we get a king of the Jews? We have Pilate. He's the governor of that province of Judea. We're like, all right, what's Rome doing here in the New Testament? They're going to crucify again the Jews carrying and accusing Christ, and then the Romans carrying out that crucifixion of Christ. So we say, all right, there's just a whole lot of different things. Again, we go from no hope in the Old Testament to hope in the New Testament for the Jews. So what we find here is a very fascinating study, and again, time will not allow us to really get down deep. Maybe as we progress through some of these things, again, there's just not enough time to teach all of this stuff. There's so much I want to teach, so much I want to go through. I think I could do it every night and be all right with it. We have plenty of stuff to go through, so we'll try our best to go through this material at a fairly quick clip, and then we can get on into some other things. Now, I guess the first thing, I don't know how good that is, up there, let's go to Daniel chapter 2, if you don't mind. And let's kind of begin here and look here in our study, Daniel chapter 2. What we're going to be noticing is this colossal image that Nebuchadnezzar, again, you go back to 2 Kings 25, we begin to hear about Nebuchadnezzar and those kings, and we're going to get into those kings here in just a minute. But you hear of Nebuchadnezzar in the history of the Jews there, the Hebrew history, that he's the man of Babylon, the king of Babylon, that comes in and destroys the temple, carrying away Daniel in the first wave, Hananiah, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, I think is, anyway, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, but try to call them by their Hebrew names, and I can't. But anyway, we find those men, Hananiah, well, I about had it there. In verse 7, if you want to see that, that'll in Daniel chapter 1, verse 7, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the Hebrew youths there that I try to make a habit of doing, but obviously I can't. But anyway, the point is that Nebuchadnezzar carries these Hebrew youth away, and then he carries Ezekiel away, and he's there with the inhabitants there in the river Kibar, and then we have Jeremiah still being in the rubble of Jerusalem. But during this time, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this is important when we look at the link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because what he's going to find there is that he's going to dream. He's going to want his holy man there, his magicians and astrologers. He's like, which is very interesting, Nebuchadnezzar. He's like, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You tell me the dream and the interpretation. Of course, they can't do that. But God reveals that through Daniel, and Daniel gives God the credit. He says, there's a God in heaven that can reveal this thing for you. So what we find is that the head of that the colossal image has a head of gold, the breast and the arms are of silver, the belly and the thighs of brass, The legs are made of iron, and then the feet of iron and clay mix. So when we're looking at this, again, what's important to the Bible student is that these are kingdoms that are going to come about. So at the end of the Old Testament and part of, well, really the end of Hebrew history, we find Babylon. Daniel gives us insights to Medo-Persia, which would be the breast and the arms of silver. And then we don't really hear anything else. Then we find the Macedonian Empire or the Greek Empire, the bellies and the thighs made out of brass, and then the legs of iron represent the Roman Empire. So these were these world-conquering empires. Again, secular history teaches that these nations, well, what we find is the head of gold being Babylon, and the scriptures tell us that's what it is, so you don't have to guess about that, all the way down to Rome. So that's where we find ourselves in the New Testament. So what's happening in between here with the Medes and the Persians, the Macedonians, and then how did Rome get into power and get set up in Judea? So that's what we're going to study and what we're going to look at here in the Intertestament period. Now, again, when you look at Babylon, we notice that Nebuchadnezzar, we hear about him in 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 1. He is the king. Now, after that, in 2 Kings chapter 25, 27, we hear of a man named Evil Merodach, which he's not as, his name is evil, but he's not, he's just a king. He's not really like, that's not why they named him that. Just, it's a funny name, Evil Merodach. That's his name. So he's the king of Babylon. Then you have, through secular history, we have Nabonidus. He's going to also be a Babylonian king. And then when you go to Daniel chapter 5, 7, and 8, you hear of a man called Belshazzar. So for the Bible student, you read Daniel, and oftentimes we like teaching the first 6 chapters of Daniel. We don't really like teaching the back 6, but we're going to get into them a little bit there through this. So if you've had a question about the beasts that Daniel saw, or the ram with 2 horns and the he-goat, we're going to get into all that. So Daniel is covering that with Belshazzar. So again, Belshazzar ends the reign of Babylonian. So Nebuchadnezzar, you kind of see him for the Bible student. He comes in the scene, destroys Jerusalem. Belshazzar is having a feast in Jerusalem, and we find that he is destroyed there. And we find Darius or Darius, however much you want to get into that. If you go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, Belshazzar, again the king here that we're talking about, he makes the feast, sees the handwriting on the wall, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, that he's going to have his kingdom given up to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 31 of Daniel 5, and Darius or Darius, the Median, took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So, or 62 years old. So what we find here is this, for the Bible student, the Babylonian reign is right here in these 4 kings, what we hear about. Again, Nabonidus, we don't hear about him, but that's okay, because we have Belshazzar. And some people look at Belshazzar as not really being the actual the king of Babylon, but maybe like a kind of a puppet that they put in there, but maybe that's the case. So anyway, again, we look at this head, again, and what we're looking here in Daniel chapter 2, when you read about that this image is going to be made, and we find that he is, in verse 38, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 38, the tail end of that, thou art this head of gold. So really hard to say this is something else, so we have to kind of follow with that, with these kingdoms. Verse 32, the image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till, notice verse 34, again this is a messianic prophecy of the coming church. Daniel chapter 2, 34, thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. So they're all ground into fine powder. And we notice in verse 35 that it becomes a great mountain, right? So the church, this is going to be the kingdom. These 4 kingdoms are going to conquer the known world, but Jesus' kingdom, right, the church, is going to conquer all of this, and they're not going to be able to stop it, right? Even death doesn't stop the church. So what we find is, what are these kingdoms? Now, let's look in some comparison when we get into this, and you can flip back and forth between Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Again, we find that the head of gold is King Nebuchadnezzar, representing Babylon, the nation of Babylon. The chest is, and the arms made out of silver. It's going to be representative of Medo-Persia. So when I say, think of Median as Medo and Persia as Persian. So typically what we're going to see here, I think we'll have time today, maybe not. But they group together, right? They are the ones that are going to be, they're ultimately going to be, the two nations are going to be one, with a very interesting story. But Greece is going to be the belly and the brass, and then Rome will be the legs of iron. So it's interesting that Rome, that strong iron, right, more stronger than gold, Rome will be have a characteristic of that. But you can go to Daniel chapter 7. And when you go to Daniel chapter 7, you see these beasts. And again, we don't want to get wound up thinking this is some apocryphal type language of what's coming in the future. No, the lion that has wings is representative of Babylon. In fact, when you look at archaeology, Babylon really depicts itself a lot with the lion. It has that a lot on its temples and its gates and its cities. The lion is very present. The bear in Daniel chapter 7 will represent Medo-Persia. The bear in Daniel chapter 7 is told that it is raised up on one side, and it has 3 ribs in its mouth. We'll get to that. The idea of its being raised up on one side means that one nation of Media and Persia, one nation was greater than the other, so that's why the bear is raised up, and the 3 ribs are the 3 nations that they consume. The leopard there in Daniel 7 is represented again. They've got a leopard with 4 wings. This is Greece. Greece was often depicted with a leopard. I think Alexander the Great, that's who we'll be talking about when we get into Macedonia to Greece. Alexander the Great used a leopard quite a bit. And then in Daniel chapter 7, we hear about a diverse beast. He's a different type of beast that comes up here that Daniel sees. And he's different from all the rest. Well, what makes him different, though, is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, they have a king. But Rome's not really going to have a king, right? They're going to be a republic, or they're trying to be a republic. And then we have the Caesars, or the kings. But they're a little bit different, right? They're set up a little different. They have a senate, they have a republic, and those type of things. So they're going to be a diverse beast. It's going to be a lot different than these other beasts that Daniel sees. So when you read Daniel and you're looking at these two, and we'll get into, I think it's Daniel 8, we'll get into the idea of Daniel chapter 8, the ram with the 2 horns, one horn being bigger than the other. Obviously, Medo-Persia, he's got 2 horns. The horns represent power, the one horn being bigger. And the he-goat has 1 prominent horn, Alexander the Great. So we'll get into all that. So this is what I hope you're excited. I am. This is great to go through this. So again, don't think of anything like, oh, it's going to happen. Israel and China. No, it's none of that. It's talking about these nations. All right, let's first look at the Medes and the Persians. Now, again, this is going to be a little bit hard to follow. It's a lot of names and dates, I know, but it's important that we go through this to understand. And I think you're like, oh, wow, I never knew that. All right, so the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were part of a combined army that would end up attacking Nineveh. So we spoke about that before. Jonah goes to Nineveh. It's the capital of Assyria. He's going to go in there, and he's telling them, repent. But then we find that they're not going to repent, and God ultimately destroys them. So the nations that destroy Assyria, right at that time, was the ruling nation. Assyria includes that of the Medes and the Persians, the Babylonians, and the Scythians. So you don't have to really know that for a test or anything, but just know that these nations kind of made a league together, and they overtook the most powerful army in the known world, that of Assyria. Now, the Scythians, they weren't just interested in Assyria. They also wanted to fight Media as well. So they had other motives when they were going through this. So again, just kind of understand that this is what's happening at this time frame. Now, let's bear with me through this. Now, Astyages, he's going to reign from 585 to 550 BC. Now, this man is interesting. He's the king there of the Medes, or Median. And he's going to have a dream about his grandson is going to rise up and rule all of Asia. So he's like, oh my goodness, my grandson, right? So he's getting this threat of his kingdom, right? His throne is at risk, but again, not from a nation, but from his own grandson. So his dream was that his daughter, Mandane, would have a son that would rule, again, all of Asia. So he's kind of had this dream, and we understand that back in those times, they really took a lot of interest in dreams, and they really put a lot of stock in these things, saying this has got to be something that's foretold. Now, Astyages, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, planned to have his daughter Mandane marry the king of Persia, Cambyses. So again, names and dates is hard. Stages, he is the king of Media, or Medo. And then he says, all right, I'm going to let my daughter marry the king of Persia, Cambyses. Now, Persia is a smaller nation, so they're not really a big threat. He's like, all right, I'll just protect myself. He'll marry the daughter. So this is how we get this combined, the Medes and the Persians. So Astyages from the Median, and then Cambyses, the Persian. So they have a son. In fact, Mandan and Cambyses, they have a son, and Astyages, he remembers that dream he had, and he's like, oh man, they were going to have a son, and he's going to rule all of Asia. I've got to get rid of my grandson. So again, to put yourself in mind of these kings and what was going on, he's like, I've got to kill this kid. So he hires a man named Harpagus to kill the child. Now, again, you can go back and read onto this, and it's very interesting. But Harpagus, he and his wife actually had a son, and he died. He was stillborn. So he takes Cambyses' son, and Mandan and Cambyses' son, and he just kind of switches the bodies, essentially. He takes his stillborn infant son and unfortunately places him out in the elements, and then he says, here's proof. Here's the child's body, right? The child is dead. I've killed the kid. But actually, in reality, Harpagus has kept the rightful ruler of Medo and Persia. So we don't have the time to get into that, but when you talk about God's providence, I'll show you that here in just a minute. So this child should have died, but God had already predicted that this child would rule. So this is interesting. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 44. Again, this is Isaiah. So this is well before Mandan and Cambyses is going to have a child. You go to Isaiah chapter 44. Verse 28, notice, and those who are present for the class in the Sunday mornings have heard about Cyrus. Isaiah 44, verse 28, thus saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasures, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. What I'm getting at, friends, is the child that Harpagus kept back. His name is changed to Cyrus. This is Cyrus. He was the king. He's the rightful king. He is the daughter of a Median king, or the queen, Mandan, the princess there, I guess. He is bloodline of Median, and he is the bloodline of Persia through Cambyses. And instead of killing him, Harpagus, he doesn't kill him. He lets him live. And we find out that his name is changed to Cyrus. And if you're a fan of the history of the Bible, you see that Isaiah prophesies of this man, calling him by name well before Cyrus was even born. That's amazing to me. It's amazing. So what we have here is the rightful ruler of Media and Persia. He unites that nation, Cyrus does, and he goes in and defeats the Babylonians. He goes through and he sends, again, as we all have been studying on the morning through Ezra and Nehemiah, he sends all the Jews to go home, just like Isaiah prophesied. That's why, if you remember from, I think, last Sunday, many people said, there's no way Isaiah wrote all this at one time. All of this stuff had to take place, and then they wrote Isaiah, but the Dead Sea Scrolls show that it was one continual scroll, and that Isaiah did prophesy this correctly. So the Medians and the Persians. So when you go to Daniel chapter 5, as we made note, when you go and look at Daniel chapter 5, or Daniel chapter 7, when you're looking at that, we understand that the bear, Medo-Persia. So again, don't get caught up in the weeds thinking that this is somebody else. It is the bear. That's representative of Medo-Persia. Again, he's lifted up on one side because he's stronger, right? Media was stronger than Persia. He's got 3 ribs in his mouth. That is Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. They conquer both of these 3 nations, Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt are the 3 ribs that are in the bear's mouth. And that's what they're representative of. When you go to Daniel chapter 8, looking there in verse 3, Daniel says, then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. So again, ruling up out of Persia, he's going to be coming up out of Persia. We don't have the time to get into that, but Cyrus is going to start out from Persia, and then he's going to combine Media and Persia, and he's going to be that great emperor of that, or not emperor, but the king of that great empire. So that's what Daniel's talking about in the ram. So again, pretty easy to see that fits the description that the horns represent power in this type of language. One's stronger than the other. So the two horns, Medo-Persia. So again, as we see in Ezra, if you go to Ezra chapter 1, looking there, you can find that it is the same Cyrus. Ezra chapter 1, looking there in verse 1, as well as 2 Chronicles 36, 23. But now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord came by the mouth of Jeremiah, might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, notice, that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying. So Cyrus, he's that guy. Amazing story. And again, if you want some more information on Cyrus, that's a great passage to study, and the providence of God that he would keep him like that. Now, let's get into this and then we'll close. So, Cambyses, right? Him and Miriam, they were going to have a child. They have Cyrus. His son is Cambyses II. So when you hear Cambyses II, notice there that's kind of not that same Cambyses, but another Darius or Darius. When you hear of him, he's coming after that. So Darius the First or Darius the Great. Now, Xerxes, we probably have heard that name. Xerxes the First, again, this is the one coming down from that line. Again, think of Persia, Xerxes, Medo-Persia. Persia becomes that empire. I think Median gets kind of absorbed into that, but don't hold me to that. I think they kind of get absorbed and they just become Persia at that point in time. Xerxes, the biblical Ahasuerus. So if you're a fan of Esther, I know probably many of you are. When you read Esther, you hear about Ahasuerus. This is the same one. So this is the line that we're coming. Again, this is great. When you read this, the history, so we have Babylon and then the Medo-Persians, Cyrus, speaking about in Ezra, his, son, grandson, great-grandson, Xerxes. Sometimes it's referred to as Xerxes, sometimes Ahasuerus. There again, they're speaking different languages, so that's why that's the case. So what we find, so the Xerxes, and in closing here, just let me help you. When you go back and read secular history about Xerxes, when you begin Esther, I was trying to think of the queen, Vashti. Thank you. I heard somebody say it. Thank you. I was going to say Vespasian, but that was the Roman emperor of Rome. But anyway, Vashti, Queen Vashti, she's going, and what is Ahasuerus or Xerxes? What does he say? He says, "Parade before me with right in front of all of me in the crown royal." So some have taken that as just in the crown. Right? So you come out and parade your beauty before me and all of my guests, all these men, in just the crown. She says, "I'm not going to do that." So what does he do? He says, "Well, you're not queen anymore." So then we find throughout that, again, Esther, those years going by, is that towards the end, he seems like a little bit more of a humble person, right? And Ahasuerus was, or Xerxes was, a different man. When you read the secular history, and just to kind of get an idea of this guy, when he's going to actually lead an expedition into Greece. So I should have had a map up here. Remember, in your mind's eye, think about Media and Persia kind of being over in the Asia area, that Fertile Crescent, right? We spoke about that kind of being over there. So he's going to make his way into Greece, trying to conquer some land over there, and he's not going to do very good. In fact, there's a position there with Greece where they're going to pass over called the Hellespont. It's a short bridge, kind of the land is the distance is very short between the land. So again, bear with me here, but this is the type of man that Xerxes was. When you read about him, they were building a pontoon bridge to go across this channel to get into Greece, and a storm comes up that evening and that night and destroys all of that bridge. And this madman, he tells his people to curse and whip the river. So that's exactly what you heard. These men go out, and they go out with whips, and Xerxes says, "You whip the Hellespont so many lashes." And they had hot pokers, and they were poking this hot poker into the sea because the Hellespont destroyed Xerxes' pontoon bridge. Now, that is facts, friends. So this is the type of madman. So again, that helps me to understand Esther, that when Esther told Mordecai, I'm not going in to meet this man, right? If I go in and he doesn't extend the scepter to me, he'll kill me. Because this is the kind of man he was. He was mad enough to whip a river because it destroyed his bridge, gave it, I don't know how many lashes they gave the river, and poked it with hot irons. So this is the kind of crazy person that Esther had to go against. But what we find is time and time and time again, for those serious history nerds, we think of Xerxes with the 300 Spartans and some Greeks as well. It wasn't just the 300 Spartans. But he gets vanquished there as well, right? He can't control. So we find him being militarily, he kind of knocked down a few pegs. So what we find is a more humble Ahasuerus when we read the book of Esther, because he has kind of been humbled through all these military trials that he has not been successful in. All right. That's got us to the top of the hour, and that's kind of what I want to get to right there. So hopefully that has been beneficial to you. Any questions or comments about Babylon or Medo-Persia?